Hello, my name is Thomas. You understand me? My name is Thomas David. I'm teaching here at the University of Lausanne, and we have a very great session today on Helvécia. And our first speaker will be Aretuza da Cruz Silva, who is at the Federal University of Espírito Santo, and her PhD project is Johann Martin Flach, Immigration, Colonization and Slavery in Trajectory of a Swiss in Brazil, which investigates Flach action in Brazil and how this trajectory can shed light on the past situation of Switzerland and Swiss colonization project in Brazil. We are looking forward hearing you, and 15 minutes and I will come. But very gently. You need this.
Obrigada, eu acho. Bom dia a todos. Eu gostaria de agradecer a Isabel, a Bernard. A Isabel sofreu muito comigo. E ela convidou e eu recusei, e algumas coisas do tipo. Mas vamos lá. Essa apresentação ela é uma socialização do primeiro banco de dados da pesquisa que eu estou conduzindo. Eu decidi analisar essa possibilidade da participação da Suíça em projetos de colonização, escravidão e imigração no Brasil. A minha orientadora disse que é demais e que eu preciso reduzir. Eu concordo com ela, acho que é demais e eu preciso reduzir, mas eu ainda não fiz isso. Bem, vamos lá. Ok. Bem, a ilustração do slide é uma imagem produzida pelo Jean-Frédéric Bozet-Deleuze, um suíço que produziu a ilustração, a aquarela. Eu tenho sinceras dúvidas se em algum momento ele realmente esteve na colônia Leopoldina, ou se ele fez a partir de instruções, o que era comum para a época, mas ela representa a propriedade chamada Pombal, que era uma alusão a Colombier, um castelo que existe aqui, e ela, em certa medida, representa de maneira fidedigna a geografia do local. Mas, na verdade, hoje eu não vou falar exatamente dessa propriedade, mas da colônia Leopoldina como um todo e de um aspecto da colônia Leopoldina que é relevante para a minha pesquisa. Como eu já coloquei, eu estou fazendo essa investigação e eu estou usando como estratégia metodológica a trajetória de vida do Johann Martin Flach, porque eu acho que ele me ajuda a tratar de tudo isso e a retratar tudo isso de uma maneira mais objetiva. Então, ele é um fio condutor para a minha pesquisa. O recorte temporal é de 1809 a 1855, então eu estou escolhendo o período que o Johann entra no Brasil e até mais ou menos até a data da sua morte, no qual ele é enterrado no cemitério dos ingleses, no Rio de Janeiro. Para isso, eu estou usando um conceito de um historiador brasileiro chamado Alexandre Casburg, no qual ele fala sobre trajetória individual. Você não precisa verificar a história toda, a biografia completa do indivíduo, mas aquela que lhe é relevante para a abordagem que você pretende fazer. É uma microhistória global, a partir do Giovanni Levi e do Sanjay Subramanian. E o locus de pesquisa é um locus de pesquisa estendido. Então, eu vou trabalhar com os estados, Brasil e Suíça, e essa relação dos estados, mas eu também vou tratar desses deslocamentos internos do Johann, do Rio de Janeiro para a Bahia, mais propriamente para a colônia Leopoldina, e, em vários momentos, dos deslocamentos para Schaffhausen, para Nova Friburgo, para a Suíça, que ele fazia de maneira esporádica. Só voltando na parte de que eu preciso reduzir, porque eu estou querendo coisas demais com a pesquisa, eu vejo ele sentado em cima de uma encruzilhada. Ele está realmente como imigrante, como escravagista e como colonizador. Ele está fazendo tudo isso no Brasil. Mas, se eu tiver que escolher um aspecto só para tratar, será o aspecto da escravidão, porque é o aspecto que me parece mais forte na história dele, apesar de ser um imigrante. Só para localização, a minha região de pesquisa no Brasil é mais ou menos essa aqui. Nas pontas, nós temos, no período, os 2 grandes portos escravagistas, que é Salvador e Rio de Janeiro. A partir de 1831, eu vou começar a trabalhar com os portos e com a região ali de Campos, de Goitacazes e Ilhéus, porque a partir de 1831, esse tráfico para o Brasil se torna ilegal, apesar de nós termos, enquanto historiadores, o hábito de dizer que era uma lei para inglês ver. Ela existiu e ela estava funcionando e ela operava e ela foi usada como requisito para alcance de liberdade por pessoas que estavam em situação de escravidão. E essa lei dizia que, a Lei Feijó dizia que se você entrasse no Brasil a partir de 1831, você era livre. E aí, nós chegaremos lá. Bem, Colônia Leopoldina, Vila Viçosa, está ali ao lado de Caravelas. Caravelas, a partir de 1855, é a cabeça da comarca e é a vila mais antiga da região. Vila Viçosa, a vila onde está situada a Colônia Leopoldina, ela foi fundada em 24 de 2 de 1769. Ela faz parte de um projeto chamado... de um projeto pombalino, é uma reforma ilustrada a partir do Marquês de Pombal. Ele funda um conjunto de vilas nessa região, São Mateus, Prado, Vila Viçosa, Porto Alegre e Alcobaça. Essa vila tinha 6 léguas de distância no seu comprimento norte a sul. Era chamada de uma vila de índios por outros pesquisadores, porque realmente ela surge no interesse de conter as populações indígenas dessa região, que começaram a ser dizimadas a partir da Guerra Justa de 1808 e que estava preservada em um período anterior como uma zona tampão, é assim que propõe a pesquisadora Maria Hilda Baqueiro Paraíso, como uma zona tampão à entrada para os sertões de dentro, porque os sertões de dentro é a região... Deixa eu voltar aqui no mapa. Os sertões de dentro é a região de mineração. Então, durante todo o século XVIII, XVII, essa área aqui ela foi propositalmente, como projeto colonial português, mantida fechada. Então, o leste de Minas Gerais, o norte do Espírito Santo e o sul da Bahia funcionava como essa zona tampão para impedir a entrada da mineração para a zona mineradora, para não ter outro caminho a não ser o caminho de escoamento do ouro pelo Rio de Janeiro. Certo. A partir do fim da mineração, ou do fim do auge da mineração em Minas Gerais, naquela região, essas zonas começam a ser abertas. Ah, desculpa, é a mania dos moleques do 8º ano. Vamos lá. Essas vilas dessa região, que compõem a Vila Viçosa, elas são vilas chamadas também de vilas farinheiras, ou eu, pelo menos, as chamo dessa maneira, porque a economia produtiva dessas vilas do extremo sul da Bahia, até São Mateus, no Espírito Santo, era a produção efetiva de farinha. E essa produção efetiva de farinha ela tem uma característica quanto à escravidão. São poucos escravizados para muitos senhores. Por quê? Porque a produção da farinha não depende, como do café, de muitos braços para sua produção efetiva. E é uma economia de subsistência. Então, economicamente, não são vilas ricas, não são vilas de grande poder aquisitivo. Certo. Em 1817, essa vila, a Vila Viçosa, ela é descrita como uma vila de 1.100 habitantes, de pessoas brancas, índias, mulatas, negros livres, mas também negros escravos. Então, 1817, ela tem 1.100 habitantes. É governada por juízes ordinários. Em 1818, na região dessa vila, ou mais propriamente, nos sertões de dentro dessa vila, é fundada a Colônia Leopoldina por alguns imigrantes. Nessa carta dos fundadores, eu achei uma coisa que eu não estava esperando. Aliás, vamos ser sinceros, né? Toda semana eu acho alguma coisa que eu não estava esperando. Então, eu encontro na lista dos fundadores JMF. E JMF, nesse período, nesse contexto, era Johann Martin Flá. Só que Johann Martin Flá não era, até o momento, um fundador da colônia Leopoldina. Mas nessa carta escrita ao imperador e à própria imperatriz, ele assina do lado dos fundadores. Eu tenho uma lista, e a lista desse lado aqui são os colonos, e a lista do lado de lá são os fundadores. E ele está aqui, JMF. Por que ele assinou em iniciais só? Eu também não entendi, mas outro momento da conversa. E aí, ele aparece como um dos fundadores, o que me dá a ideia que o processo de fundação da vila ele estava envolvido, porque, nesse momento, de modo direto, ele não está na colônia Leopoldina, mas ele está no Rio de Janeiro, porque ele atuava como secretário da imperatriz e ele tinha os negócios dele no Rio de Janeiro. Então, tecnicamente, ele não estava aqui. É a informação que eu tenho até hoje. E as informações que eles dão é que, em 1818, a colônia foi fundada e que esse território era às margens do Peruípe e que era a área ali, era uma floresta virgem e que era a área de perambulação de índios. Quem eram esses índios? Esses índios eram a população de Pataxós, Machacali, e quando eu falo área de perambulação, eu quero dizer que eles não tinham uma presença fixa naquele lugar, porque a lógica desses povos era ir da nascente do rio até a sua foz durante um período anual de caça e coleta, ou mais que anual, vai depender da dinâmica interna. Certo. Eu sei que o Johann de vocês é um cara protestante. É um homem protestante, deixa eu falar direito. Eu sei que ele é um homem protestante, ok? João Martinho Flash, falando no português bem aberto, é um cara católico, absolutamente católico. Tanto é que ele era muito próximo da Leopoldina, e eu encontro no arquivo eclesiástico da Cúria de Teixeira de Freitas Caravelas a transcrição paleográfica de uma petição que não existe mais no arquivo original, dele solicitando ter pia de batismo e missa. Eu falo, gente, como assim? Porque, quando eu o conheci, ele já estava pedindo para ter pia de batismo e missa. Eu não sabia que do lado de cá ele era protestante, que essas pessoas não se juntavam. Então, ele solicita para ter pia de batismo e missa em 1836. A Vila Viçosa odiava a colônia Leopoldina, e a colônia Leopoldina odiava a Vila Viçosa, eles não se davam bem, não queriam se relacionar. Eu imagino que tem uma relação de poder forte aí, porque você é o súdito do rei, e, de repente, chega um conjunto de pessoas que não são os súditos do rei, que são estrangeiros de uma língua não portuguesa, e eles começam a receber mais direitos do que aqueles que eram súditos do rei. Então, é um primeiro ponto de tensão. E eles conseguem terras e estão economicamente ascendendo em uma região de uma economia de subsistência. É outra questão. Certo. Ele pede para ter pia e missa, e ele consegue. Eu não sei exatamente quando a pia e a missa é autorizada. Havia um oratório na fazenda dele, e todo esse princípio ele é regulado pelas constituições primeiras do arcebispado da Bahia, de 1707. As constituições do arcebispado da Bahia, ela é a legislação que diz como a Igreja Católica vai funcionar e vai agir nos mais pequenos detalhes. Então, a morte, o casamento, o batismo, a construção da igreja, a não construção da igreja, o formato da pia, tudo é definido pelas constituições. E as constituições primeiras, elas vão definir que o batismo ele é um ato católico recomendado a partir dos 8 dias de vida, que ele pode ser realizado tanto para aqueles recém-nascidos, como para as crianças, como para os adultos. Mas ele precisa ser realizado porque ele é prerrogativa para a salvação. Certo. O recomendado era 8 dias de vida. Então, esse sujeito, de 8 dias de vida até 7 anos, ele é caracterizado como inocente. A partir dos 7 anos, ele é criança. E depois dos 14 para homens, ele é adulto. Se uma pessoa não foi batizada nesse período correto aí, ele é adulto, as constituições primeiras dizem que um adulto está sendo batizado porque ele veio de terras pagãs, de terras onde o cristianismo não existe. Então, toda vez que nos meus dados eu encontro um adulto sendo batizado, eu sei que aquele sujeito acabou de entrar da África. Então, o batismo está sendo realizado. O batismo está sendo realizado segundo um princípio católico, mas ele também está sendo realizado segundo um princípio de posse. Porque, em uma sociedade majoritariamente analfabeta, você batiza na vila onde você tem fazenda ou no lugar onde você tem fazenda, para poder garantir um documento escrito que aquele ser humano lhe pertence. Porque aparece no registro de batismo que fulano é escravo de cicrano, e cicrano é daquela fazenda, às vezes, e às vezes aparece até a idade ou alguma outra característica. Certo. Na aquarela, você vê lá naquele canto uma construção muito semelhante a uma igreja. Essas construções de igrejas, elas eram comuns nas fazendas do Brasil. Às vezes eu olho alguém falando assim, não, porque a fazenda era autossustentável. Sim, é óbvio. Porque para a gente sempre era óbvio, porque as fazendas são autossustentáveis, porque 2 minutos já, meu Deus, nem cheguei lá. Certo. O registro de batismo ele vai ter a presença de batismos de livres, de escravizados, de libertos, de indígenas, mas os indígenas não são obrigados ao batismo, eles só vão se eles quiserem. Isso aqui é um exemplo de um registro eclesiástico, no qual diz, aos 20 dias do mês de março do ano de 1843, nessa freguesia de Nossa Senhora da Conceição de Vila Viçosa, batizei solenemente e pus os olhos santos ao inocente Luísa, nascida 28 de fevereiro de 1842, na Colônia Leopoldina, filha legítima de Aleixo Borel e Francisca Maria Coelho, aquele natural da Suíça, e esta da Corte do Rio de Janeiro, hoje fregueses dessa paróquia. Foram padrinhos James Henrique Borel e Júlia Veriga, natural da Suíça, por procuração que apresentou Henrique Ruquenin, o que, para constar, fiz este assento e assinei o vigário Norberto da Costa Azevedo. Então, isso é um exemplo da estrutura normal de um batismo. Eu vou pular a metodologia. O que eu encontrei depois de tabular os dados de 1829 até 1847? Eu encontrei o batismo de 2.122 pessoas nesse período. Esse batismo foi realizado em 1.713 assentos, que significa que muitos assentos foram coletivos, o que não deveria ter sido feito, mas foi o que foi feito. 549 crianças, 549 adultos e crianças, e eu encontrei 426 adultos escravizados. Isso não é normal para o Brasil. Eu não encontro dados ainda para poder fazer essa discussão em termos de Brasil. Uma vila entrar 426 adultos escravizados, depois da Lei Feijó, então significa que toda essa população aqui deveria estar em liberdade. E significa que o que os suíços estavam fazendo aqui, nesse período, é tráfico. Eles estavam levando gente, desrespeitando a legislação do Brasil, para poder manter a produção de café. Só para ter uma noção, minha pesquisa de mestrado é sobre Alcobaça. Em Alcobaça, de 1845 a 1856, eu só encontrei um adulto sendo batizado. Colônia Leopoldina, 426. Então, eu ainda estou com esta questão para resolver. Acabou? Certo. Provavelmente, esses adultos, que eu gostaria de conseguir responder por onde eles entraram, estes adultos entraram por portos ou por praias próximas a essa região, porque eles não entraram pelo Rio de Janeiro, eles também não entraram por Salvador, porque nesse período os navios da Marinha Inglesa já estavam fiscalizando essas áreas. Mas eu tenho 426 adultos que entraram num período ilegal para trabalhar no café na Colônia Leopoldina. Muito obrigada.
I would like to thank the translator. She is doing a wonderful job, really. I think we can do this because... And now we have the pleasure to have Yuko Miki, who is an award-winning historian of slavery in Brazil and the Atlantic, and she's a professor of history in Latin American and Latin studies at Fordham University. Her first book, Frontiers of Citizenship, A Black and Indigenous History of Post-Colonial Brazil, has received several awards, and she's currently completing her new book, Calonga, The Story of the Last Slave Ship to Brazil. So the floor is to you, and I will come.
Okay.
Show you.
Então, Good morning, bon dia, bonjour à tout le monde. Thank you so much for having me here, to Isabel and to Benhard. And I was very shocked when I first received this invitation because I didn't know somebody had read my stuff in Swiss stuff, my research in Switzerland. So it's very nice to be here. And this is actually research that I did for my first book, so I'd actually had moved on, so to speak, but it allowed me an opportunity to revisit it and kind of go back to things I had researched a while ago, to looking at photos again from old documents, but also to now realize that for me, to be perfectly honest, Colônia Leopoldina, which I'm also going to talk about, was just a very small part of my research. But to know that other people are researching at different angles, and this, I had no idea about Swiss immigration. It's not something I thought about as a theme. So it's really kind of giving me a new context to think about it. So I appreciate all of you for kind of allowing me to kind of develop a new way of perspective. So today I just want to share a story about Colônia Leopoldina, which Aretuza just talked about. And as you know, this was a Swiss, but also a German colony. And it thrived over the course of the 19th century, but for all the wrong reasons. And for me, you know, I also came to this topic not because it was I intended to, but out of coincidence and failures and many other things, and the kindness of others. So I was going to work in Salvador and Quilombos, the communities of people who had fled slavery, and yet it fell apart very quickly. And then it just so happened that somebody from Museu Nacional, Olivia Maria Gomes da Cunha, introduced me to a student who was doing his research in Helvécia at the time. And that's how I began to think about this part of Bahia that I had literally not thought of at all. So when I started looking initially into the archival sources of this southern end of Bahia, I started looking into the sources, and then I learned, as you all know, Helvécia, to me the name meant nothing, right? Was formerly a successful colony, known, as you know, as the Colônia Leopoldina, founded 1818, 1819, I've seen both mentioned, on the eve of Brazilian independence. But what really astonished me were the archival sources, not just on the colony, but on the broader region. And this is very important because, yes, first of all, you know, there were so many sources on enslaved people, revolts, quilombos, those abounded. And that was surprising because so much of the scholarship I knew was on big plantation zones, Rio, Sao Paulo, maybe Minas, but I was like here, and yet there was such rich documentation on enslaved people and resistance. But I was also finding something that I was not expecting at all, and that was on indigenous people. And this because I'm from Tokyo, in case anyone's curious, I'm from Japan, but I've done most of my higher education in the United States. And the way I was trained also in Brazilian history was indigenous people mostly had disappeared, right, from coastal Atlantic Brazil by the colonial period. So I was like, why are there indigenous people on the Atlantic coast of Brazil, 19th century? What is going on? Then I realized that as I began to find out about Colônia Leopoldina, it's not just there, it's in the middle of a territory that was involving many Black and indigenous people, and it was full of conflict, right? So that's very important to say. It's not just Black, it is also indigenous, and that's where this colony is being founded. So for the rest, I'm just going to give you kind of a quick, swift journey through 7 decades of the history, starting with its founding, and in particular, the aspirations of the Portuguese crown, and then the early post-colonial Brazilian state, that what this colony was supposed to fulfill. And it doesn't go too well, and we'll see why. But the colony does survive, becoming another theater of conflict in the final years of slavery in Brazil. So, sorry, this is my shameless self-promotion moment. Why not, right? My editor in São Paulo is being very happy with this. So what I'm presenting here today is derived from my first book, Frontiers of Citizenship, which first came out in English from Cambridge University Press, and just this year finally came out in Brazil. So it took so long, but it finally came out. So it came out from Companhia das Letras in Brazil this year, just in May. So I got to do some events, which was very lovely. So I'll be sharing some additional material today that does not appear in my book. And in fact, I'm working, as was just mentioned, on my new book, which actually is about the last slave ship to Brazil, the Mary Smith. And I was going to talk about the Amazon, but because of the 15 minutes, I cut that part out. So the Swiss and German colonists who arrived in southern Bahia, but then known as Porto Seguro, on the eve of Brazil's independence, were not just arriving in empty lands. It was a zone of war. The Portuguese crown had given them this Sesmaria, this land grant, in 1818-19 in this territory. It was a captaincy, right? Porto Seguro, small towns like Viçosa and hamlets on the Atlantic. It was worlds apart from this bustling coastal cities of Salvador, Recife, Rio de Janeiro. This war had been declared by Prince Regent João VI in 1808, but it was long in the making. This war authorized the indigenous people's enslavement, their violent subjugation, and of course, land seizure. João VI accused the indigenous people whom they called the Botocudo, kind of in this very kind of prejudice, right, this very exaggerated image. He said these indigenous people were a, quote, atrocious and anthropophagous race, unquote. He said, exactly, they were accused of cannibalism, right? Such fabricated images of indigenous cannibalism circulated during times of conquest to justify anti-indigenous violence and violence. War, slavery, and conquest would survive the end of colony and into the dawn of Brazilian nationhood. Spanning a vast area from the interior mountains to the ocean, these lands whose settlement the crown had forbidden to ban smuggling may not have exactly been the El Dorado some had dreamt of, but with the decline of interior mining, these previously forbidden lands now beckoned, seducing newcomers with the promise of diamond mines, navigable rivers, high-quality timber, and plenty of cultivable land to tantalizingly close to the ocean. So these Swiss and German colonists embodied the crown's hopes of civilizing this indigenous territory with the introduction of white free labor. It was therefore a racial and labor experiment that sought to transform Brazil's frontier regions with a specific vision of modernity. So this settlement, which they would come to call Colônia Leopoldina, would play an important role in colonizing this region, which I call the Atlantic frontier, over the course of the 19th century. I'm not sure that they foresaw the remarkable cycle of violence they would help unleash in the nation after independence, engulfing immigrants and Brazilians, indigenous and Black people, in countless territorial and other conflicts for decades to come. So this colony's founding, and I forgot to put the map, but we've already seen it from Aretuza, and I'm sure other people have a map too. Colônia Leopoldina's founding on the eve of independence was enabled, as I said, by this fusion of settler occupation and indigenous conquest. So the King, João VI, had clearly stated his territorial objectives, including special concessions to, quote, those who want to settle those precious auriferous terrains that are today abandoned due to the fear caused by the Botocudo Indians. And he provided generous incentives to settlers, including Sesmarias, the land grants, debt forgiveness, and freedom from paying the royal tax for 10 years. In 1811, 3 years after initiating the Botocudo Wars, the king approved assistance for 3,000 colonists who had entered in the lands free from the invasion, these are his words, of barbarian Indians from this region, before it would be incorporated later into Bahia. So of course, as we know, there's a lot of kind of people coming in to tear down trees for settlement, etc. So they were distributed among new arrivals. By 1811, 381 Sesmarias were granted in a single military district. And then in 1818, the crown begins to support immigrant colonies in this region because João VI had authorized land grants to foreigners. With assistance from the governor of Bahia, so in 1818 or 1819, the German naturalist Georg Wilhelm Freireis and 5 fellow immigrants from Switzerland and Hamburg received their grant. A few years later, they were joined by other Swiss and Germans, including Jan Martins Flach and Georg Anton von Schäfer. Flach named his property Helvécia, Schaefer was a colonization agent with close ties to Pedro I, Brazil's first emperor, and José Bonifácio, Brazil's father of independence. And he encouraged Schaefer to invite Germans to settle here as well. And they named their colony after Maria Leopoldina of Austria, who would shortly become the empress upon Joan VI's return to Portugal in the ascension of his throne to the throne of his son Pedro I, who remained in Brazil with his consort after independence. So this colony was founded around the same time as Nova Friburgo, and it became among the first European immigrant colonies to be founded by non-Portuguese persons. So this was my chance to kind of revisit old archival sources. So this colony was located on nearly 11,000 hectares of heavily forested land inhabited, as mentioned, by Pataxó, Machacali, and Puri Indians. And by the way, just total side note, it was such a coincidence that my editor from Compañía das Letras is Afro-Indigenous and his grandmother's Machacali. So he was shocked to see that it was kind of his own history. A natural canal linked the Peruípe River to Caravelas River and the Atlantic Ocean through a labyrinth of mangroves. Large ships arrived from Salvador and Rio de Janeiro, navigating up to this port nearby, and to load themselves with the colony's coffee, became a coffee plantation, which would gain fame and be exported even to Europe, and it was known as Café de Caravelas. With the expansion of agricultural production, the colony's relative proximity to the ocean provided invaluable for its ability to sell its products to Salvador, Rio, and Europe. And at its apogee, it was nearly 53 square kilometers on both sides of the Peruípe River. In exchange for the crown's sponsorship that included land, livestock, and tools, the colonists were required to observe stringent residency and production regulations. But among these, the most difficult rule to meet was those regarding labor. In an 1820 decree, the crown required, required the grantees to work half the land with the labor of their own families and to distribute the other half among other immigrants whom they were responsible for bringing. So very importantly, this decree effectively prohibited the use of slave labor, right? The labor project was very clear from the point of view of the crown. So it had to be white, it had to be free labor. So indeed, this crown's embrace of Swiss and German immigration presents an important counterpoint to the scholarship that is focused on the rise of immigration debates in Brazil during the later 19th century, when the economic and political elite of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, realizing the inevitability of abolition, advocated for European immigrants as a replacement for slave labor. So this early embrace by the crown of immigrant labor and their prohibition of slave labor and its favoring of Swiss and German colonists indicate that by the early 19th century, it was already seeing white European immigration as an antidote to what they saw as the excess of Africanness and slavery. However, conflicts over land access began the moment the colonists set foot on the soil in southern Bahia. Already in 1823, the aforementioned Jan Martins Flach found himself in conflict with the residents of nearby Vila Viçosa. We just looked at the baptismal records. People in Vila Viçosa were complaining about the Colônia Leopoldina, saying, we don't have any more lands. They literally, that's what they said. And Flach said, oh, they're just being envious. Flach insisted that when the colonists, quote, took ownership, tomaram posse, of their lands, that these lands were still covered in virgin forests and infested by savages. This is a very common refrain from a colony to nation, in which many people did not recognize indigenous people as the land's inhabitants, right? So this is evidenced by Flach's contradictory observation that he said, there's a land of 10 leagues that's in the same state of virgin lands, inhabited by the Indians known as Puri. So he's saying they're virgin, they're empty, and they're inhabited by indigenous people. It's a contradiction, but for them it was not. So he insisted that the residents of Vila Viçosa were just trying to, quote, destroy or at least impede the progress of this nascent colony, unquote, and was careful to emphasize the great promise of Colônia Leopoldina, which, with government support and more families, he said would bring great advantages not only to itself, but also to the state. So in defending the Colônia Leopoldina's rights to land, Flach was already keenly aware of the multiple purposes this colony could fulfill, for the crown and then for the state. So it's not just about agriculture, right? First, he said, look at the location and the period of founding. Immigrants were, above all, the agents of settlement and colonization of frontier territories undergoing violent state incorporation. This included both internal and inter-imperial frontiers, such as those in the extreme south. Second, the immigrants also served as a buffer against enemies of the state, whether hostile indigenous people or foreign powers, especially the Spanish forces in Rio de la Plata, and offered manpower in the service of war. Therefore, the colonies of São Pedro, Rio Negro, Nova Friburgo were, just like Colônia Leopoldina, founded in indigenous territory. And the aforementioned Schaefer, the German guy, was an immigrant recruiter who brought in Germans to serve as colonists and mercenaries, 3,000 of whom served in the Cisplatin War against the United Provinces of Rio de la Plata. Third, immigrants also promised to improve these frontier regions, which the elite considered backward, with a welcome dose of economic development and European civilization. A local judge expressed his admiration for Colônia Leopoldina's cleared fields and orderly rows of coffee trees as embodiments of European-style progress. He exclaimed, if only all of Brazil had roads like these. And finally, Joan VI, the monarch, had envisioned making immigrants into small proprietors who would form an intermediate class between large landowners and slaves and complement the large estates. So after independence, official support for the colony continued under Pedro I, who ordered the local government to assist the immigrants in encouraging what he called the great advantages it could bring to the state, unquote. Flach was thus alluding to the Brazilian state's many hopes by invoking the colony's progress, the wealth it could create for Brazil with its products, mainly coffee, and the ability to, as this is Flach, what Flach said, to provide their people in times of an enemy invasion. And by that, he probably meant indigenous people. 8 years later, the colonists enlisted the help of the Swiss consul of commerce, right, le consul du commerce de la Confédération Suisse was his title, Auguste Tavel, to file a complaint on their behalf with Francisco Carneiro de Campos, Brazil's Minister of Foreign Relations. Tavel demanded that the Viçosa municipal chamber seize what he called their arbitrary and illegal violation of the colonists' right to property. And then he alluded to the damages that Brazil's European colonization ambitions may suffer if the Colônia Leopoldina colonists were to be denied the fruits of their own labor, which would then discourage them from inviting their relatives. And he said, if this doesn't work out, maybe your whole European immigration thing is not going to work out. But in spite of the insistence of Flach and the Swiss consul, the Brazilian state would prove to be increasingly lukewarm towards the colony. This marks a significant change from the time of the colony's founding, just a decade earlier, and also from the time when Joan VI and Pedro I both enthusiastically supported its success. Why? Why did they become lukewarm about it? Beyond a general disinterest or other more pressing concerns, there was one principal reason for this change. Colônia Leopoldina was not, strictly speaking, a European immigrant colony. It was a slave plantation. Its coffee production was doing well, the Bahian president Vasconcelos said in 1842, but he said much more would be accomplished if all agriculture were done by free workers, which was supposed to be the case. 5 years later, the diminishing allure of the province's only prosperous colony was another regarding this, another president observed that, he said, it's a shame that all this coffee and manioc is not produced solely by free workers. So in 1832, Colônia Leopoldina counted 18 plantations run by 86 whites and 489 enslaved people. By 1858, 39 years after its founding, it was home to 40 plantations, 200 free European and Brazilian-born residents, and close to 2,000 enslaved people. So these are just more lists to just share with you guys about the names and the names of the property. I'm sorry the quality is not the greatest, but you see the names of the properties and the owners. And I guess you guys would know better than me who's Swiss and who's German and who's from Hamburg, etc. For me, it's no say. The colony's growth trajectory exposed how much the poster child of European immigration had totally veered off course. This was an embarrassment to the nation-building aspirations of the Brazilian political elite. Far from showcasing the marvels of European free labor in the hinterland, the immigrants comfortably delegated the back-breaking work of coffee production to the enslaved. Colônia Leopoldina's economic success became a bitter testament to the fact that the conquest and settlement of this frontier region was accomplished not by European enlightenment and civilization, but by the enslaved labor of Africans and their descendants, and sometimes indigenous people, that it was meant to eradicate. By the middle of the 19th century, and there's another one, of course, the big one is, of course, Yamanchis Flach, Helvécia, with the biggest number of enslaved people at this point, 108. By the middle of the 19th century, public attitudes towards the colony were downright chilly. sharply in contrast with the praises of its past. Brazilian and foreign observers alike criticized the colony for depending on slave labor instead of encouraging further European immigration. The harshest critics claimed that Leopoldina could no longer be considered a colony, as it was, quote, now inhabited by a great majority of foreigners who own coffee plantations, whose cultivation is handled by approximately 2,000 slaves, unquote. Subsequent to these dismissals, this darling of colonization ventures, though economically vibrant, began to disappear from official government reports in a clear indication of its diminishing worth and promise. The Swiss and German immigrants may have been content with their accomplishment. Vast, orderly coffee fields tended by a few thousand enslaved people had replaced formerly uncultivated virgin lands, whom they called infested, right, with indigenous people. But this was undeniably far from the conception of racial and economic progress that the Brazilian government had envisioned. And to be honest, they'd done little to actually support it. But what's interesting to me is that Flach and even the Swiss consul earlier had made no secret, they had made no secret of the colony's slave population and economy, openly discussing the enslaved on the colony, in spite of its prohibition by the crown at the time of the land grant. I personally haven't come across any document, which doesn't mean it doesn't exist, in which the planters at any point espoused abolition or decried the evils of slavery. Maybe some did, I don't know. But I found the opposite. The colony experienced its first uprising in 1832, when the German colonist Schaeffer's slaves shot another planter, dragged Schaeffer's wife back to his plantation, and beat her mercilessly. The Swiss complained to their consul that Schaeffer was leaving his blacks in an entire insubordination, an ominous example for the blacks on other plantations, unquote. Schaeffer's slaves, they said, were armed with rifles, went to the Leopoldina plantations to incite the blacks there to join them and kill the whites, unquote. So far from decrying the evils of slavery, they actually just criticized Schaeffer's lack of slave management skills. Was there a Swiss-German tension? I don't know. And they showed their eagerness to discipline their slaves and discourage them from, quote, raising a fearless hand on whites without receiving the punishment they deserve, unquote. So their interest was not to depict themselves as efficient and productive free laborers. They were like, we're good plantation managers. We know how to manage our slaves, right? And I'm saying slaves because of their perspective. So they're like, in 1847, one guy actually says, oh, the previous administrator was terrible, but under me, he's like, everything's good, the fields are clean, there's a great amount of manioc, and the slaves are satisfied, he said, never missing a meal. It's like, look what a great plantation manager I am. So of course, a lot of this continues. A lot of indigenous slavery continues in this region illegally after 1831, when it's again abolished. And I'll conclude. But this colony endures. After the slave trade ends in 1850, they were able to maintain a labor force because of they basically kept children in bondage illegally. And then finally, an abolitionist appears 1888, and the colonists are horrified because they claim this abolitionist priest was telling the enslaved to rise up, to attack their masters, and they're like, oh, but we thought things were just going to continue as before. Why is this guy messing things up? But only at the very end, with abolition, they finally say, the great fact of general emancipation ties us ever more intimately to the Brazilian family. And then they say, with the government's protection, our colony can serve to attract immigrants who, like us, will undoubtedly enjoy the hospitality of the Brazilian lands. So 70 years after its founding, the colonists were finally ready to become an immigrant colony. So I'm just gonna say that I don't have the perspective of the Swiss people. How was this colony sold to them while they were still on this side of the Atlantic? And I thought maybe Hans's presentation yesterday, Fabio's Federal Migration Society, I was just curious about how this venture was sold to these people to go to these indigenous territories and what they were expecting. Did they want to be slave owners from the beginning? Or was it something that happened after they came? That's my curiosity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The last speaker of the session is Denise Bertschi, who holds a doctorate from the Arts of Science Laboratory at the EPFL, which is, 100 meters from here, just in front. And her research is located at the intersection of visual culture, urban studies, and history of coloniality. And her work also take the form of video installations and film. And she published, among others, a monograph on state fiction, the gaze of the Swiss neutral mission in the Korea delimited zone, but you are not going to talk about Korea now, but on the other projects related to Brazil. So I give you the floor.
It's wonderful to be here, and I want to, of course, also thank Isabel and Bernhard to organize and bring everyone in this room here. Especially, I appreciate everyone that took the long trips from Helvécia to come here to Switzerland. Thank you. My presentation is entitled Agence Consulaire Suisse, Léopoldine, the Swiss federal government stamp on the land of Colônia Leopoldina in southern Bahia. My forthcoming book, built on my doctorate thesis, approaches the entanglement of Swiss coloniality in Brazil and Switzerland under the lens of archive, visuality, and land. We talked a lot about methodology, so the first part is also a bit how I approached this research of the last 8 years. It reflects on the manifold ways the young Swiss Confederation's consular stamp, Agence Consulaire Suisse Léopoldina, you see it on the left, has produced an imprint on the colonial archive of the Swiss Confederation, the land in the south of Bahia, and on memories of violence but also of resistance in Helvécia's Quilombo community today. The enduring legacy of racial capitalism in the former Colônia Leopoldina in northeastern Brazil were heavily shaped by the Swiss plantation owners who relied on slavery-based exploitation on both the land and the workers. The long process from land grab, deforestation, mostly done by indigenous people, to the settlement of monocultural coffee plantation in the 19th century is echoed by the contemporary condition of Helvécia, a Quilombo community of descendants from Colônia Leopoldina's enslaved African Brazilians, and today's orbiting megastructure of eucalyptus plantations. The violent memories from slavery times are highly connected to invisible signs in the landscape that circle in today's Helvécia, which stands in stark contrast to the historiography of the Swiss official state archives. Represented and protected by a Swiss national consulate. It was first run by the Bahian consulate in 1833, and then their own consulate from 1861 on in Leopoldina itself, placed in the colony in the mid-19th century, in a crucial moment of Swiss nation building when the Confederatio Helvetica received its first modern constitution. This research demonstrates the Swiss state's making, not only in the homeland, but on distant land, and its direct involvement in coloniality in Brazil. With a focus on aesthetic and spatial processes, my book contributes to the Swiss colonial history with a precise in situ case study between really this space of Colônia Leopoldina in Brazil of the 19th century, but also Helvécia of today, and echoes with the city of Neuchâtel in Switzerland, where most of Colônia Leopoldina's planters originated from. And considerable colonial capital was converted into the city's architecture and in its institutional landscape. Reconnecting these entangled territories is urgently necessary, not only to understand the ecological ruination in the plantation, but to introduce another way of reading Swiss landscapes shaped by colonialism and slavery. So the intense involvement of the Swiss federal state in Colônia Leopoldina in supporting the slavery-based plantocracy challenged the notion of Switzerland's colonialism without colonies. That's really what I want to challenge a bit. Even if the landowners were bourgeois families from Neuchâtel or Schaffhausen, like Flach, I argue the role of the Swiss consulate in Colônia Leopoldina and its colonial bureaucracy, today held in Bern in the Swiss Federal Archives, demonstrates significant support in upholding slavery and racial capitalism in Colônia Leopoldina. I'm combining in the first part of the book archival research based on close reading of historical but also visual sources, primary but also secondary literature like travelogues, and in the second part, it's on visuality, and the third part is on the land. So where there I had another approach, which was based on urban field research and oral history, where I spent some time in Helvécia. So in this first part, I looked at how can we revisit these archives that are not only in Bern, in the Federal Archives, but also in Bahia, in the State Archive. Someone told me once that this is actually a mistake, that these federal archives are still in Bahia. They should all be in Bern, but I think it's a very good gap, because it gives access to Brazilian researchers to research them. We've seen many of them now already in some presentations. But what I also look at is the buildings, as after Achille Mbembe, that are the buildings of archives, and how they are very closely entangled actually with the archives, with the documents that are held in these buildings. You see on the right side also the castle of Neuchâtel, where the cantonal archives are. And then a second lens how I approached the archives is to look through the materialities and the visualities in the document. So it's more like an ethnographic approach to the archive rather than a kind of classical historical one, where I was very intrigued by the stamp of the Swiss Confederation in all its variations. On the left, you even, sometimes they're even just drawn after the original stamp. So to think through these stamps, we can see how state control was executed in labeling documents that represented the state's essential concerns. So this stamp's physical pressure somehow inscribed on the colonial governments, both in Brazil and in Switzerland, leaves, of course, these material traces in the archives, but as I argue, also in the land. Then the third one is kind of paper, which is the obvious materiality of the archive, although there I'm very interested in what I call archival proximities, in looking at which document is after the other one. And sometimes there are very inspirational ways of reading the archive, of seeing what document is kind of happens to be after another one. And also the fragility of these almost 200 years old documents sometimes, and how they are fragmented and even falling apart, and how we can read somehow a more affective history through these materialities of the archive. The second part is on visuality and kind of understanding. It should somehow demonstrate how beautification, we saw one of the presentation of Pombal now many times already. Yeah, you see it in the middle. How beautification, romanticization, poetization, assimilation, and appropriation through visuals were essential visual practices for the colonial gaze to incorporate and conquer the colonial space. The gaze on and image making of plantation landscapes were thus crucial to the visual grammar of colonization. And in this is also through this visual lens that I read all the travelogues of also people that have been mentioned, like Freyreis, Tölsner, who was a doctor on the colony, or also Agassi, who traveled through the region, to look for these kind of visual metaphors that they use to then understand somehow this process of beautification, romanticization in the colonial gaze. And the last one is where I try to kind of come from the other side and look at how, from the presence on, and to understand how the land, and the land as a palimpsest of time, can speak to the history of this colonial capital, this chapter of colonial Switzerland. Through the organization of 5 so-called infrastructures, I was able to bridge and juxtapose the oral history of today of the local people of Helvetia, but also on the memory of colonial Leopoldina of the 19th century and how this is inscribed in land, often even by invisible signs. And also to read this in parallel with today's eucalyptus plantation of Suzano, the biggest producer of eucalyptus in the world, kind of thing we have to see in a continuum. So a second so-called infrastructure is the infrastructure of violence, on which I will speak a little bit today to give a little glimpse into all of this, the most difficult one. And the infrastructure of resistance, infrastructure of transportation, rivers, ports, always under this kind of overlapping of the memory of the 19th century and what is there today in the new eucalyptus plantations, but then also the infrastructure of accumulation. We have already also heard a little bit how then certain of the capital from Bahia has traveled back to Neuchâtel, the foundation of Préfargier, which I have very closely read, as well as the Wildberger Tower in Bahia. We hear more of it today. And another example I looked at is the Ethnographic Museum of Neuchâtel, which used to be a private villa of the De Pury-Demeurant tobacco enterprise. So now I have actually planned to more work to present something which goes more closely into this role of the Swiss state. You can read then the book if you're interested in that. In this very case, so it's one of your 15 cases. The Leopoldina one has, in that sense, I think already been looked at quite extensively. But I decided also to bring now in another methodological aspect, which is that of oral history. And it's really the most difficult one for me. I have worked over years to kind of find my own positionality in this, and I'm very happy also to discuss these methods afterwards in the discussion. So from these infrastructures I just presented to you, I chose to present a glimpse into this infrastructure of violence. And I would like to also add this trigger warning in the beginning of what follows, is that many of the orally transmitted stories I heard in Helvécia of violence against racialized children and adults will appear in the session that follows. But to give a little bit of a theoretical frame as well to how to revisit these memories, I'm reading just 3 little quotes, maybe not all of them, of Ariella Azoulai's book, Potential Histories: Unlearning Imperialism. To repair the violence, historians must go on strike, to know that the violence still exists and that there is no such thing as the post-colonial world. And of course, Denise Ferreira da Silva, Unpayable Debt, she is used to this kind of violence that is done, but to which no one is assigned blame, responsibility, because it is always already authorized, the violence perpetrated or allowed by the state. Again, I have the state of the Vice-Consulate of Leopoldina in my mind. And Avery Gordon, in her book Ghostly Matters, it is our responsibility to recognize just where we are in this story, even if we do not want to be there. And I'm very happy that here we speak from very different places. Okay. So now I give a short introduction in how these violent memories are often inscribed with local specific places in landscapes. For example, this one is a tree in a shaka tree, a bit outside of Helvécia, where some of the people of Helvécia have brought me to, saying that this is the place where the Casa Grande was standing. And I was very intrigued by this, for me, unreadable, visible sign in kind of as a monument of Swiss coloniality that I could never have approached, would it not have been given access through oral history. And how can we read this tree as a kind of symbol of a visual memory and as a kind of memorial also of Swiss coloniality, of something that is visibly not there anymore, the slave owner's house. Yeah, I'm skipping a little bit. We can also talk about it later, these documents, because we have already seen them. Yeah, but I'm introducing now, next to this tree, another kind of invisible memory in the community of Helvécia, which was reappearing. And that was, I'm starting with a quote from Tonia of Helvécia, who said, "My uncle still has the iron and the slave's chains, and then I don't know where he put it, because the enslaved used to be mistreated. As I told you, the older ones were treated badly, and the third ones were treated better in the master's house, so everyone wanted to go there, to the enslaver's house." One morning, I followed Daniel, who's also a member of the community of Helvécia, on a walk through the village. He led me to an inconspicuous place that we see here on this image. He stopped to perform with his own hand how the enslaved used to be chained on the tronco. He says, "Someone tried to show me where the tronco was. I don't know if it's truth or if it's a myth. But they say there was the porao, where the slaves were held." End of quote. Daniel stretched both his arms to the side and reenacted it with his own body, what you can see in the image, in what physical position his ancestors were put, hands fixed with the rings on the crossbeam to be beaten. He says, 3 sticks, one on top and the other 2. They were there with the rings the way they put the slaves, and the slaves stayed in that position, right? End of quote. Daniel describes further how he transmitted his knowledge of space to his own boys when he told how he played with the slingshot to them. And the stone fell next to where the tronco used to be. And he said to the boys, quote, "Oh boy, this is where the slaves were beaten." End of quote. By playful, almost playful in a questionable way, intergenerational everyday actions, playing with the slingshot was an occasion to pass down knowledge, thereby keeping the mental map of past times alive. In fact, it isn't only a mental map for these children, but the mapping of a real place, which does not bear any visible sign today, nor material trace of the current event anymore. One can see a patch of land at the side of a fence with some palm trees and other plants overgrown. I will finish with the last quote by Anne-Laura Stoller, who says, and I think it's more kind of thinking how these kind of invisibilized places can become a monument. This is not a turn to ruins as memorialized monumental leftovers, but rather to what people are left with, to what remains blocking livelihoods and health, to the aftershocks of imperial assault, to the social afterlife of structures, sensibilities, and things. Such effects reside in the corroded hollows of landscapes, in the gutted infrastructure of segregated cityscapes, and in the microecologies of matter and mind. And I'm stopping with this. Thank you.
Thank you for your very interesting presentations. Eu não sei se posso fazer a primeira questão em português para a Aretuza. Ok. Nos registros que viu, interessou-se para saber quem eram os padrinhos dos escravizados e dos homens livres? Os padrinhos. E depois, quando pensamos no catolicismo negro no Brasil, uma das coisas que me vem à mente é as confrarias de homens negros. Eram essas associações católicas de entreajuda entre pessoas negras livres e escravizados, que angariavam dinheiro para comprar cartas de alforria e também organizavam festividades ligadas a tradições de origem africana, à volta de festividades ligadas ao culto de santos negros, africanos, como São Benedito de Palermo. Pode dizer-me se as pessoas negras da Vila Viçosa faziam parte desse tipo de comunidades? And I have also a question for Denise Bertschi. I have a question for you. How did the members of the Quilombo of Helvécia perceive your work? And in your ethnographic work, did you collect, I don't know if the term collect is right, songs or legends related to the enslaved people's life?
Primeiramente, eu quero parabenizar a todos por estar falando da minha comunidade. Fiquei muito, assim, emocionada. E sobre a colônia Leopoldina, eu queria perguntar para a Ilka. Não é exatamente uma pergunta, mas assim, eu queria mais contribuir. E quando você fala sobre os povos indígenas, ali na comunidade, entre Caravelas e a Vila Viçosa. E assim, eu fiquei muito tocada e impressionada como o tamanho da violência é tão grande que a gente não tem a presença desses povos na comunidade. E uma outra coisa é que você fala sobre o padre, que acredito que é o padre Geraldo, e eu gostaria muito de lê-lo. E sobre a terceira pessoa, a última, você fala que tudo o que aconteceu, ou muitas das coisas que aconteceram no século XIX, hoje a comunidade passa exatamente por isso, em relação a Suzano, essa monocultura do eucalipto. Mas, assim, mais tarde, eu vou estar falando o que a gente tem feito frente a isso, para a gente conseguir existir. O que a gente tem... De que forma a gente tem resistido para a gente conseguir existir a essa forma de violência da qual nós estamos passando? É isso.
The last question, but I have two.
I have a question to Denise. Could you please speak a bit more about this colonial visuality? What kind of elements were highlighted? What kind of the use of landscape, for example? Can you say what can you say to us about this visual narrative about coloniality? Thanks.
Então, sobre os padrinhos. Quem era o padrinho vai depender de quem era a pessoa e quem era a família que estava sendo batizada. No caso das famílias suíças, é uma discussão que eu ainda não cheguei, mas eu sei que existe. Algumas famílias suíças que estavam como colonos e senhores de escravos na Leopoldina, eles não eram católicos. Eles estavam dentro do rito católico, mas como uma forma de receber assistência espiritual, sendo protestantes. Então, é meio complicado, mas era isso que estava acontecendo. Então, eles batizavam com outros protestantes no rito católico, como uma forma de não ficar desassistidos. E o padrinho, nesse caso, era um padrinho protestante também. Quando eram escravizados. Normalmente, o batismo acontecia com outros semelhantes e, às vezes, algum livre forro. E, normalmente, em senzalas grandes, da mesma senzala, às vezes com outras senzalas, mas, normalmente, o traço do apadrinhamento é o reforço dos laços intragrupo. E eu encontrei uma coisa que foi um pouco fora do padrão para a região, que foi o batismo de famílias indígenas por escravizados. Então, eu falo, onde foi que esses dois se encontraram, gente? Como assim? Porque as famílias indígenas, elas são muito fechadas, elas reforçam os laços e, às vezes, geograficamente, elas se colocam assim à parte na cidade. Eles são indígenas vilados, eles estão ali na vila, mas eles estão à parte da cidade. E, nesses casos, eu encontrei indígenas que estavam sendo batizados por pessoas que eram escravas. Então, isso me fala sobre trabalho compulsório, porque eles só podem ter se conhecido no eito, eles estavam no trabalho. E, por estarem no trabalho, eles desenvolveram uma afinidade, uma similaridade, porque você entregar seu filho para o batismo no rito católico não é qualquer coisa. É um ponto. Mas eu acho que, né, nos 3 aspectos são esses. Quanto às confrarias, eu estou imaginando que a sua referência das confrarias seja o que aparece sobre a Bahia, sobre confrarias e tal. A história do extremo sul da Bahia, ela não faz parte da história da Bahia do Recôncavo. Nós somos outra coisa, outra conjuntura histórica, outra construção. Então, como essas vilas elas são todas do final do século XVIII, algumas coisas que são comuns, recorrentes e que reforçam laços de solidariedade no Recôncavo não são comuns e recorrentes no extremo sul da Bahia. Então, eu não encontro, nem em Vila Viçosa, registros e dados sobre confrarias e comunidades negras no sentido de conseguir alforria. E é também uma realidade muito urbana de Salvador, a possibilidade de levantar esses valores. O que os dados demonstram é que, em realidade de plantation, a possibilidade de liberdade é extremamente rara. Eu vou encontrar alforrias em Leopoldina, nenhuma por compra. Todas as alforrias eram por culpa paterna. Culpa paterna é um termo meu, tá? O senhor era pai daquele escravizado, ele ia na pia, reconhecia que era pai com outros dois senhores e libertava aquela criança. A mãe seguia a vida que tinha, escravizada. O filho era liberto. Quem foram os senhores que fizeram isso, assim, declaradamente? Eu tenho outros senhores por indício, mas declaradamente. Alfred Confrane reconheceu filhos com escravizadas na pia e libertou. Fernando Cunde reconheceu filho na pia e libertou. E o João Fareoli Marmilon reconheceu filho na pia e libertou. São as únicas alforrias que eu encontro no processo até o momento.
Melhor responder em português, talvez? Será? Ok. Tá bom. Primeiro, uma grande honra poder compartilhar minha pesquisa com alguém da Helvécia, né? Obrigada pela chance e oportunidade, também para abrir esta oportunidade para mim. E essa história de parte indígena foi não esperada, porque eu digo que eu entrei no meu doutorado querendo estudar diáspora africana. Foi o doutorado que eu entrei, né? Eu ia só estudar a comunidade afrodescendente, né? Mas só que quando comecei a pesquisa que eu descobri essa história indígena, né? Muito rica, mas muito violenta, né? Sobretudo no sul da Bahia. E a Ayala, né? Graças a Ayala por ter compartilhado essa pesquisa dela. A Ayala está na esquina, né? Dos índios Camacá. Porque, como falamos ontem também, né, ainda tem uma grande divisão, não na experiência vivida, mas na experiência acadêmica, em que ou você estuda populações negras ou indígenas. Muitas vezes, como vocês sabem, não é a experiência, né? Mas também eu cheguei no momento em que eu ia escrever este trabalho e pensei, eu tenho suficiente informação sobre história negra para escrever só sobre isso. Mas eu também soube no processo de escrever meu livro que essa ideia que nós aceitamos como verdade, que não tem mais índios, é uma ideia feita, fabricada no século XIX. no campo de antropologia, no campo dos colonizadores, dos acadêmicos, até essas pinturas, né, de índias mortas, né, celebrando as origens do Brasil, essas imagens românticas da literatura, né, sempre reforçando a ideia de que os índios não pertencem ao presente. Né, e eu acho que muitos acadêmicos têm reinventado e como digestido essa ideia sem criticar, né? E isso eu acho que é um ato de violência que podem fazer os acadêmicos até com as boas intenções, né? Então, para mim, era muito importante reconhecer povos indígenas da zona, em que muitas vezes pessoas, digo também, quem estuda a história negra da plantation, né, trabalho e produção, trabalho escravo, tem essa ideia de que as plantations se espalharam em terra virgem, terra vazia, né? Não reconhecem que era terra indígena, né? E então, eu não queria repetir esse tipo de pensamento também. Então, para mim, estudar, eu digo, Colônia Leopoldina não foi o centro, o foco da minha pesquisa, mas virou para mim uma maneira de poder como estudar como colonização de fronteiras, né? Nas terras brasileiras. No meu caso, no século XIX, o que provocou foi a expansão da escravidão negra africana, mas, ao mesmo tempo, a renovação da escravidão indígena, o trabalho forçado indígena. Eles se encontraram no mesmo lugar, na colônia Leopoldina, nessa zona, exatamente nesse momento da conquista territorial, que fazia parte do nascimento da nação brasileira, né? Que isso, para mim, foi muito importante reconhecer essas duas histórias, né, como eles se encontraram nessa época, que não é uma coisa colonial, é do Brasil moderno, né? E falando do Padre Geraldo, para mim, uma das grandes figuras. Eu estou super curiosa, né? Você também mencionou uma coisa, é uma padre que chegou na última hora, já que a abolição já era anunciada, que ele chegou com uma São Benedito na mão e entrou na colônia. Isso segundo uma delegada da polícia que comentava, né? Ele chamou o padre de um satão, que era o diabólico, que ele entrou assim na colônia e falou aos libertos: vocês são livres, os estados, os seus os escravócratas não querem dizer para vocês que são já livres, né? Vocês não sabem, vocês são livres. E que ele para as pessoas da colônia era como um escândalo, né? Uma pessoa que veio para disturbar a continuação do sistema de trabalho escravo, né? Ele assim foi como visto. Mas depois é interessante porque este padre, que era abolicionista da última hora, também, depois da abolição, teve um programa de trabalho forçado, em que ele queria que as pessoas da colônia ficassem lá para trabalhar, não escravizado, mas quase num trabalho dependente. Ele queria fazer uma nova colônia de trabalhadores, que era quase igual à escravidão. Ele tinha esse plano, né? Essa ideia de que os libertos não têm disciplina, que precisam de alguém que a vigiassem para trabalhar, etc. Esse discurso, né, muito comum. O padre também não era diferente. E foi isso. E só quero acrescentar no final que só depois da abolição houve uma grande revolta das pessoas libertas na colônia Leopoldina, um ano depois, e a causa era a falta de terras, porque eles eram libertos, mas não tinham a terra para cultivar. Então, houve uma grande revolta na colônia, mas isso foi depois da abolição, que eu achei muito interessante também.
Thank you. It's really a great pleasure to be in this round of such specialists. And yes, I try to be short. So the perception in Colonia Leopoldina, I was there twice for several months in 2017, so it's some time ago. And I didn't have time to kind of contextualize why I arrived there as a complete outsider. First of all, I want to state that I wasn't there alone. I was there with some people from the University of the south of Bahia, from the Cheira de Freitas, and we were a small group of people. It was not that I just kind of walked into the village. And why did I get there? I think it is really important. 2017 wasn't a moment when this Swiss consciousness about our colonial history has been really widespread. It has been really still a very big kind of amnesia around it. We have heard about it through other presentations that even the state has really kind of denied this, but but also in public perception. When I started, I was actually invited by a Brazilian curator who was at the time the director of the Modern Art Museum in Salvador da Bahia, in Solar União. I met him in South Africa, and he at the time said, I'm preparing an exhibition about coffee's history in Zurich, and then he invited me to participate in this exhibition in Zurich in the, I forgot the museum. It's a coffee museum. Yeah, Johann Jacobs Museum. And he then said, you have to go to Helvécia. And he then sent me there together with some people from the university. So just that was a bit the moment. And I have to say that, of course, there is resistance in the community, which I can only understand, that, you know, this kind of a fatigue produced when you have to kind of tell these violent stories and so on, people coming into the community and kind of wanting to mine your knowledge on your personal lives and the lives of the community. So I'm writing about this, these moments of difficulty also, but not just what people said, but more these encounters and the silences that were also a way of protesting, of sharing histories. But for me, there was this one moment when I shared that in Switzerland, people don't think in general that Switzerland has a colonial history. And then they were like, what? We are this history? Like, how can they? And that was kind of a very intense moment when all of a sudden they wanted me to bring to this tree, to that place, to this, like this happened here, and it started kind of this sharing of this story in the sense like, how can it be that Swiss people don't think we are part of a common violent history? So, I mean, that's just a short answer to this question of the perception. And the visual landscape, the visual strategies. So I analyzed many of the paintings we've seen here now many times in different, and what I really see in them is this kind of, first of all, I mean, it's mostly white Europeans that produce these images in the sense of creating like a beautification of the plantation enclosure as a harmonious space. Most of the time, white people are not really depicted. Krista Thompson, an art historian who worked on, I think, Haiti, I'm not quite sure, really talks about this, that, you know, this kind of absence of the white, which was, of course, they were the big minority, is kind of to naturalize the black bodies worker into this landscape as if they were part of it, you know, in a harmonious way, as in the same way as the coffee plant, which was also not from Brazil. It's also kind of an introduction. So, I mean, so this kind of harmonization and beautification. And then one other strategy that I found a lot is kind of the differentiation of the dark forest as kind of the space, of danger, of indigenous life, where, you know, so this kind of very, and this in the picture that you showed in the very beginning of Pombal, you see this very clear divide of the plantation space and of the so-called indigenous forests, virgin forests, so-called virgin forests. And there is a very, often they're also called as a rideau, as a curtain. So it's kind of this very clear division of space through visuality that would divide these two spaces, which of course are full of conflict, as we have very beautifully heard. So, I mean, these are just, and then in the travelogues, there's a lot of kind of references to the European homestead. You know, like this is how beautiful we can walk into around the fruit trees. So there's a lot of kind of beautification and comparison to European homestead landscapes. So this is another kind of justification through visual language that happens. But I mean, yeah, there would be much more, but this is definitely enough for now. Yeah, can't read my own voice. My own. Yeah.
So thank you very much for the presentations. Maybe a general question before. Maybe you can help me close some gaps about the families with which I'm working. You about Denise, you perhaps some. I have some data from the archives in Neuchâtel, but they're like fish. How do you say this? Like small cartons, small papers that the archivists did years ago about Swiss colonists that went to Brazil. So yeah, so there are a lot of mistakes there. So I want to close some gaps with you and check some information with you about the consul and with you. I mean, I still have a question for you, Yoko. And Aretuza, acho que fiz uma pergunta geral em inglês. Eu tenho uns dados do arquivo do estádio Neuchâtel. Eles fizeram uns cartõezinhos de brasileiros que foram para a Bahia. E muitos deles me interessam, porque eles fizeram dinheiro no Brasil e o dinheiro depois voltou para Neuchâtel. E acho que você pode me ajudar a fechar algumas lacunas, sobretudo porque você mencionou alguns nomes de uma sociedade que eu mencionei ontem nas minhas fontes, que é a família, é a sociedade Borel, Beguin e Huguenin. Você mencionou isso, então é muito interessante para fechar. E you, Yuko, just a question of an understanding. Sorry. Okay, tudo bem, desculpa. Because I also wanted Denise to understand it directly. Cool. Yuko. Sorry. Yuko, você mostrou uma lista no final de colonos suíços e ao lado o número de escravos que eles possuíam, é isso mesmo? Porque eu acho que eu reconheci vários nomes das famílias que eu estou trabalhando. Eu vi lá o nome, Philippe Huguenin, Pierre Borra. Isso me interessa muito, tá? Só para a gente fechar, depois a gente troca.
Yesterday, I talked about Jakob Laurenz Gsell from St. Gallen, who was a slave owner in Rio, a merchant. And I realized that I had only been interested in him in Switzerland and didn't know anything about the slave rebellions that he wrote about in his letters to his mother. Today, with you, Yuko, I realized that there is also the opposite problem. When you talked about Johann Martin Flach, and the question, what did he expect before he went to Brazil? What were his expectations? Did he know about slavery? And I realize that in my work, and I do a lot of work on Schaffhausen, what happened to the Flach plantation after the death of Johann Martin, I realized that I was only interested in the plantation in Brazil, in Helvécia, and forgot to ask the question about Switzerland before. And I can just tell you I cannot answer your question, but your question has inspired me to go deeper into the Swiss side. And I think it's the wonderful thing about this conference that questions go back and forth across the Atlantic. So thank you for your question. As soon as I have the answer, I will contact you.
The last question, because I think that the translator needs some break. With all the work that you are.
Obrigada a todas pelas apresentações brilhantes. Eu tinha uma pergunta para a Aretuza, mas agora eu acho que se converteu em um comentário a partir da sua fala do encontro de registros de batismos de escravizados batizando indígenas, Aretuza. A historiografia, como o Yuko disse há pouco, né, tendeu a invisibilizar, silenciar os indígenas, e aí eu acho que a gente está num momento de não mais fazer isso, né? E acho que os indígenas estão se impondo na tua pesquisa, e vai enriquecer teu trabalho, e você vai dar uma enorme contribuição à historiografia brasileira, se você buscar perceber essas relações sociais, que podem ser relações de trabalho compulsório, ou até trabalho assalariado, e que continua sendo rico. Mas, mais do que isso, eu acho que tem relações sociais importantes aí. Porque a gente precisa pensar, e o Yuko já mostrou isso, né, que houve relações de violência e muita violência nesse processo que você estuda. Mas eu acho que você consegue avançar demonstrando relações sociais estabelecidas nesse processo. Porque os indígenas nessa região eles não estavam só resistindo e lutando para viver. Eles estavam reelaborando suas vidas, negociando. E negociar significava, muitas vezes, se moldar, lançar mão de novas estratégias em busca de se manter naquele território, onde eles têm como território de pertencimento, mas de outra maneira agora. Então, eu acho que vai enriquecer muito se você der atenção a isso, e, de repente, você pode não encontrá-los como na categoria de índios, nos registros, né? Porque isso é muito comum nas fontes do 19 no Brasil, os indígenas irem desaparecendo enquanto índios da documentação. Mas se você, que é uma ávida pesquisadora, como já vi que começar a cruzar as fontes, eu acho que ver quem são os pais das crianças, por exemplo, talvez eles apareçam em outros registros como indígenas, porque eles vão desaparecendo também ou mudando de identidade nas fontes. Nas fontes que eu pesquiso, tem caso de indígena que aparece como indígena, eles migram para outra região como poceiro, e depois eu os localizo, décadas depois, como indígenas de novo. Então, mas é um trabalho, claro, de cruzar fonte para identificar esses sujeitos históricos, né? Mas eu acho que vai enriquecer muito o teu trabalho e a historiografia também. Obrigada.
Thank you very much. Can you answer briefly 1 minute per person, please?
Então, Ricardo, na Bahia tem um santo, que é o santo dos historiadores, o nome é Urano de Andrade. Boa parte das suas angústias se resolve lá. Porque algumas coisas que a Ilko mostrou, eles estão no Arquivo Público da Bahia. E com esse santo, não necessariamente você precisa ir no Arquivo Público da Bahia. Mas, só sendo mais objetiva, o Beguim, Borel e Huguenin, eles aparecem constantemente como senhores de batismo na Leopoldina, como senhores de escravos nos batismos da Leopoldina, e alguns batismos familiares também. Eu produzi uma lista que eu não apresentei aqui, mas entre os senhores que eu tabulei, o que mais batiza nesse período é o Johann Martin Flá, e ele batiza muitos adultos e muitas crianças. Eu não fui preparada para trabalhar no mundo acadêmico. Eu sou a primogênita de uma família que lida com gado. E eu vejo muita técnica de rebanho. É muito serviço de tratamento de gado. Literalmente, assim. Então, eu vejo o Johann Martin Flá comprando mulheres e homens proporcionalmente. Ele está buscando reprodução endógena. Então, assim, e aí eu vou encontrar outros senhores fazendo coisas semelhantes. Então, existe uma lista quantitativa que eu fiz, no qual o Johann está primeiro, o João Batista Bacalhão, que é português, está depois, Pedro Peike, Abraham Langans, Gustavo e Constâncio Jacardi, Pedro Beguim, Augusto Confrane, Gustavo Borel, Alfred Confrane. E eu preciso ainda sintetizar, porque alguns nomes eles aparecem escritos de maneiras diferentes. E aí a gente precisa limpar depois, mas eles estão entre os senhores que mais batizaram no período. Ayala, obrigada pelo elogio. Eu, sinceramente, fico preocupada com tamanha responsabilidade, espero que dê certo. Houve um tempo que eu pesquisava história indígena e, por causa de alguns historiadores da indígena, eu falei, eu vou sair para sobreviver, mas ela volta atrás de mim. Só um comentário rápido antes de eu passar em frente. Eu só sou uma doutoranda do primeiro ano. Aos pesquisadores da Suíça, especialmente, todos que quiserem me ajudar, eu preciso de ajuda, enviem fontes, documentos. Ei, você precisa ler isso, melhore. Eu quero, por favor.
Só rapidamente, eu respondendo a tanto a Ricardo um pouco, esse nome do Flach Borel, Flach não é do Neuchâtel, é isso? Flach é do Schaffhausen, ok, eu que não conheço a geografia. Mas sim, como eu escrevi, tenho várias listas, acho que vocês vão reconhecer melhor os nomes do que eu, né? Mas eu estava pensando, pelo menos no caso do Flach, eu usei um inventário no final do período da abolição, em que tem um cara chamado Anacleto Flach, mas ele é negro. Então, eu acho que ele herdou o nome do senhor, né? Mas ele, no final da vida, tinha vários cafezais, tinha propriedade. Parece que, nesse caso, ele tinha vários parentes na colônia e parece que ele conseguiu acumular uns bens, né? No inventário que achei no arquivo público. Eu não estou continuando com esta pesquisa, mas os inventários que estão no arquivo público, talvez ele olhou, né? Pode ser uma coisa interessante. Do lado, essa coisa da imigração, porque eles imigraram, falando de Hans, eu estou super curiosa também. Eu também sou imigrante para os Estados Unidos, né? Temos vários motivos, mas eu estou super curiosa para ver o que eles imaginavam, né? Se você descobriu como, how do you say, a colônia Leopoldina, essa zona do sul da Bahia foi vendida, marketed, para os suíços. Eu estou muito curiosa, porque era um lugar proibido para colonizar, mas também tinha tantas imagens desses povos indígenas, antropófagos, etc. Né? Era uma imagem que circulava muito, né? E por isso, né? Como é que os suíços pensavam nessa zona? Para mim é uma curiosidade. Obrigada.
Yeah, on that, I think we can have a session after and share. Like, there's a lot, and was part of our long researches. I forgot to answer your question, or a question more a remark, is also how can today the resistance against the Suzano companies, the today's plantations, work. And I just want to say that Suzano is a company that is also registered in Switzerland. Its CEO has been studying here in Lausanne in the business school that formerly belonged to Nestlé. And he's a very powerful businessman in kind of multinational way. And I've been doing quite some research on kind of, tracing him in the Swiss landscape, because these are the ones that have the power on these struggles over land and labor in today's region of South the Bahia. Their office is in Nyon, which is also not so far, hidden in a supermarket, upstairs of a supermarket, like a very mundane supermarket place. And there, I have made a film about this. And there's just kind of a door where it's written Suzano. It's most probably just a letterbox company, but they handle this kind of invisible capital that is done on the lands where formerly the Swiss were colonizing African people and indigenous people in the place of Leopoldina. So these continuities are very important, and we have a political struggle here in Switzerland also to bring these multinationals to justice, to perform their human rights to be more kind of responsible for their human rights practices. And I think through this, it's also a way of repairing what has been done. So I think we have to really read this also on the question of repair, how we can treat such big companies.
Just a last word. I think we could congratulate the three speakers. Thank you very much.